Super. Okay, so this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of Natural Resources Wales and Swansea Council's journey into greening Swansea city centre. And it started back in 2019, so there's quite a lot to cover. I'm not going to do an intro slide. I'm going to jump straight in, and I'm going to jump straight in with our conclusions. So if you fall asleep at the beginning of this because it's too hot where you are, we want you to work with nature, not against it. We want more soil, more water, more vegetation. We want a multifunctional approach. I've mentioned multifunctionality a lot. And we don't just want more greening, we want clever greening. We want you to be asking what that greening is doing. Did I go to the next slide? Nope. Oh, hang on a second, it's skipping through them, isn't it? Right, okay, I'm not going to labour the point on this. In Wales, we have a really strong policy context to deliver places where people and nature can thrive together. You'd assume with all of this stuff, we'd just be doing it, right? So it's not that easy, and I'll come back to that in a minute, really. And that was kind of, if we've got all of this great policy and legislation, what is it that's stopping us being, a multifunctional green place for people and nature, and crucially the economy? Always seems a bit controversial to say culture eats strategy for breakfast when you're talking about writing a strategy, but they're expensive. They take a lot of resources. Oh, hang on a second, press the button. There you go. Sorry, going back. So they're expensive to write, they're resource intensive, and you need to make sure that you're actually putting your money and your efforts and your energy, because a lot is needed, into the right things to achieve. Our aim was to achieve that we ensured we enhance the quality and variety of green infrastructure in development across Swansea central area. Because if not, what's the point? So just to be clear, that's Peter Druck, who's the management consultant who famously said this, culture eats strategy for breakfast. This doesn't mean that strategy is not important, but rather that a powerful, empowering culture is a surer route to organisational success. And I'm guessing there's quite a lot of people here from the public sector today, and culture change within the public sector is slow. And on this journey, we had to find a way to speed it up. We took a really specific focus on the Swansea central area because it was going through a once-in-a-generation regeneration programme. And we knew we needed, it's completely different to the rest of the county. We really needed to take a different approach in that area. So the strategy gave us the hook to change the cultures and behaviours, but it doesn't do this alone. It is just a document at the end of the day. But doing lots of engagement enabled us to enhance the conversation around green infrastructure. We kind of ended up unintentionally creating an informal network to share ideas, empower thinking, and crucially really learn from each other, learn what's stopping us doing things, what do we need to do, how do we support each other to do this, where do we bring the expertise in. We knew when we started this journey, we didn't have GI expertise within NRW and Swansea Council in a way that we needed to. So we procured consultants to work with us. And I think when we look back at the start of our journey, we were developing our own sort of team culture. We used the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act as it was a core part of how we set up our team values, our behaviours. We used the ways of working, and that was really important because that mandated us to go and do true involvement engagement work. And we could have done more. It's not perfect, but it is very different from traditional the ways traditional strategies have been done. We brought in Green Infrastructure Consultancy, as it was then, which was Gary Grant and Dusty Gedge, and they brought their expertise. And we used the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act to actually procure them as well as part of the procurement process. It was an open tender. We had lots of different organisations who came in. But we used that to ensure that we got someone who was part of our team, rather than you just paying a consultant to go off and do their bit and then give you their bit at the end. We all worked as part of a team. It was quite different. And we had a flat structure in our team hierarchy. It was shared jointly between NRW and Swansea Council, which meant that each organisation could challenge the culture within the other organisation and open up conversations in a way that you can't do when you're inside your own organisation. So that was quite interesting. So what did we do? So firstly, we didn't write anything until we completed all of our engagement. We didn't consult anyone. I mean, we did much later because statutory you have to when you've got a draft, but we didn't consult anyone. There was no conning or insulting anyone. We went out and we chatted to people. We worked with Urban Foundry, who ran workshops with professionals, attending already scheduled meetings, and generally being available to meet. So if they were meeting somewhere, we would go along. We held business breakfasts so that we could enable people not to have to take a whole day off work. We tried to be as flexible and available as possible. And we used our GI consultants to share their knowledge of what green infrastructure is, what it's not, and helping us all find the way to do it. It meant we could just build relationships really fast, and raise our collective understanding of the issues really, really quickly. We also did street-based community conversations where Penny Griffiths and myself Penny Griffiths from Swansea Council, we were the sort of two project leaders on it. We went out and spoke to over 630 people face to face for, I think it's like 3 weeks. And we went to the market, we went to museums, we went to where people were. Again, we didn't put up a poster and ask people to come to where we were going to be. And that's really, really important when trying to engage with a community. We also never used the words green infrastructure, because if you asked people on the street what green infrastructure is, I mean, it's just, it's more jargon, isn't it? We got loads of it. So we asked people what nature in their city was to them. And from that, we got these, we actually got 5 themes. The 5th one's not on there because it was Castle Square, which was previously greened as Castle Gardens. Then it's become really hard. And now the ambition is to green it again. But here, the 2 I'm going to draw your attention to. So there's 4 there, which is well-being, loss, the physical aspects of nature, which is the butterflies, birds, butterfly, bees kind of thing, and opportunities, which is the speech bubble. But the heart is our well-being theme, and this was the comments that people made that described their emotional response to nature. Being part of their human experience, space to breathe, slowing down, feeling relaxed. Joy was used a lot, those kind of things. And then if we look at the loss theme, which is the rectangle in the bottom in the grey, this was where people talked about, well, it's ugly now. We don't have castle gardens anymore. We've lost trees. We haven't got any more green space. It's concrete, it's hard, it's uncomfortable. Someone actually told us they didn't want to go into town when it was really hot because it wasn't a nice place to be. Which was really, really, really useful, and quite interesting. And so from that, and all of that engagement that we put together, we created some PIs. Again, I'm not going to labor the point on the PIs because this is about the process, not the actual output at the end. This is about people and how we communicated with them and how we brought them on a journey. The really important bit for us in the strategy is this here, which is the multifunctional, the strategy's principles of green infrastructure. This is what we use to ensure quality on our schemes, and it's worked really, really well. And every scheme that comes through within the Swansea Central area, we use these principles to check, is it delivering? Is it green infrastructure, or is it a bit of bling? I think that's going to change to the next slide. So I did mention multifunctionality earlier, and it is one of our principles, and it's particularly pertinent right now. So it's pretty hot outside, and we're expecting to see more of this as climate change really, really continues to bite. If our cities and our urban spaces are not comfortable, people are not going to want to hang out in them. And if our people don't want to hang out in them, that massively negatively affects our urban spaces and the communities that are in there. So I think when we think about urban cooling, and we think about, for Swansea, we've obviously got Swansea Bay. So the water in the bay is really, really important, and keeping that clean. I know Dan is going to talk about sustainable drainage in a bit, so I won't go into that too much. But if you go outside today and you stand in a hard urban space, it's uncomfortable, it's unpleasant. And people actually told us in our engagement that the previous summer, with the dry high temps, I mentioned this earlier, they didn't want to go into town. And recently in Forest Park in Swansea, I saw on the internet, a business had cut down a tree, and someone in the comments had actually written, nice, now we have no shady place to sit. So that person's probably not going to go to that area. We are talking dwell time here. We are talking economics. This isn't just it's nice for people, or it's nice for nature to have nature in our cities. Its functionality is really, really critical in making our places where people and nature thrive together, and where they go and they hang out. So I'm just showing this one. This is a picture from the Waits Family Enterprise Trust, who we've worked with on a couple of projects with Urban Foundry. this is a nice kind of image of nature-based neighborhoods, and it gives you some of those elements around, because there's lots of jargon out there: green infrastructure, working with nature, nature-based solutions. But communities understand things like nature-based neighborhoods. And I think, oh, sorry, I just skipped ahead again. It skips, but it doesn't skip back. Right, there you go. I'll get there in a minute. But yeah, so I like this one. I think at the bottom, when it talks about communities coming together to care for spaces. Now, let's be clear, I'm not talking about seeing our community and volunteers as free labor. It's really important we don't do that. Gardening is a skilled profession. And but we do want to encourage people to spill out into their places, to care for their places, free them up to pull the buddleia if they see it, or tell someone not to drop litter there, or, do something about something, or ring tin if there's a problem. But you do need to have a bit of a broken window policy with new schemes and replace things and fix things. And that's quite important. So key learning from all of that is ask lots of really good questions. Learn each other's language. So if you can't speak the language of a person in a profession and you don't have the credibility in their field, get someone who does. It's really important when you're trying to come from maybe a conservation team background and you're trying to influence regen or engineers in highways. It's really important to just have a variety of people who you can share things from. And, it's really hard in the current climate to spend time with each other. We're doing this on Teams. 5 years ago, would we have had a meeting, get together? I don't know. Teams is great, but we're not having those face-to-face conversations. We're not building relationships in the same way. So just recognizing that time with people actually really helps push some of this stuff forward, building solid relationships, pushing new ways of working forward. And the meaningful engagement. It's absolutely critical. Not only as the public sector do we have to do it through the involvement principle within the ways of working of the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, but it's essential to the success of schemes. If you're doing anything in the public realm and you do it without people, it is destined to fail. We have been working with Kate from Urban Foundry on a couple of other projects that are not in this, unfortunately, where we're doing a sustainable urban drainage, active travel scheme, school plaza outside of school, currently under construction. And, engagement is a skill. And it's often best delivered by an expert, not necessarily those doing the project. So recognizing who has the skills, where they are, and investing in the right people to go and deliver that stuff is really, really important. And again, working with the experts with proven track records. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Recognizing if you don't know and this isn't an area of expertise for you, who you can work with. And engaging your politicians. It is political. In Swansea, we had the cabinet member for regeneration come to our workshops. It was great. That's that leadership mandate to the staff. And we presented all of the community engagement back to full council, so we could tell them what their electorate was telling them. And then a kind of unintended sort of consequence we had was we were working with consultants who were not product affiliated, and that ended up giving us a really good balanced view of what products were appropriate in what places, rather than schemes that are just using one type of product, because actually there's a multitude of things out there on the market that are useful for different things. So that was kind of an unintentional one, but it was really good. So really quickly through the challenges, there's is it bling or is it the real thing? So if you look at something, I want you to go outside today with your sunscreen on and have a look at some greening in an urban place and ask what it does. So if you use our 5 principles of GI, so is it bling or is it the real thing? Is it good for air quality? Does it hold to particulates? I'm not necessarily going to expect you to know that, but does it make you feel good when you walk past it? Does it look nice? That's the amenity value. Is it good for biodiversity? Can our pollinators actually fit into the flowers? Because some flowers, they can't. Does it change seasonally? Because actually that makes a difference to how you feel around it. And, the knowledge, skills and training. So we spent a lot of time working with lots of partners and Urban Foundry, because they did a lot of the facilitation in the early days of the workshops. They ended up becoming really interested in green infrastructure, and they've run off with SPF funded projects, training small businesses, individual roofers and things around green roofing. And they had a festival recently to sort of celebrate some of the stuff that we've done in Swansea, which has been amazing. So what? So we wrote a document, we had lots of conversations. What's it done? It was adopted in 2021 because of COVID, obviously, 2020. We have started to move towards taking a sponge city approach where we're looking at the urban landscape as an opportunity to capture water, slow it down, clean it, use it, and lose it. And so that losing it is either in the groundwater or up in the air through evapotranspiration in the plants. I come from a water quality background, so SUDS is kind of my thing, but I'm not going to go onto it too much because I know Dan is going to talk about it a lot. Something I did want to touch on especially is the Regeneration Swansea work, which is, I don't know if every authority has them in the same way, but Swansea's has 26 organisations. We have, I think it's like 60 something people. And at the last one, we actually had, 35 attendees. That was on Tuesday, came along to talk about how we manage sort of investment grants and stuff within Swansea areas. This is actually a green roof that was really recently installed. So they're tiny, tiny plants, which is why it looked more brown than green. But I didn't manage to have time to go up and take a new photograph of them growing. But this was fully funded. So one of the really interesting things about the Regeneration Swansea is we worked with Welsh Government to influence the Transforming Towns Placemaking grant in its current form. So from the strategy work, the engagement work we did, we took our engagement roadshow to a Regen Swansea meeting. We taught them all about everything GI, and now there is a green infrastructure thematic in Transforming Towns programme. So you can fully fund green infrastructure through regeneration funding, and that's really important. And there are some other successes, but I know time is getting on. I just want to show you some pictures of the so what. This is the temporary space in Swansea. It's earmarked for development and phase 2 regeneration programme. And we just thought, could we do something a bit temporary and interesting with urban greening? So it's now a pocket park. It's got 2 green roof bike shelters. It has planters that demonstrate a range of habitats around Swansea. Been a huge success, more than we really expected it to be. And it's completely and utterly activated that space, which is a great consequence. This is the headquarters of the recently rebranded Beacon Social Housing headquarters on High Street. Originally laid with plastic grass. Clearly someone had an intention to green it. And the then Director for Development, Gareth Davis, was really interested in could they have a green roof put on it. So it's now about 3 years old, I think now. And there's actually a roofscape on both sides of the building. So they had the same kind of thing on the other side. We've got 2 biodiverse extensive green roofs. We've recently been up there as, again, the training open foundry ran, doing some more planting, adding some more substrate, looking at where the maintenance needs to be done because their own caretakers maintain it. But it really has transformed the space. It's quite different. This is actually Open Foundry. We're really interested in what they could do from a green infrastructure point of view on their buildings. They happen to have buildings which are listed, which is always an additional challenge. So there was a bit of a journey in terms of what they could have and what worked. So we ended up with a series. We've got 3 the downpipe disconnectors, essentially, like rain planters is what we often call them. And even in heavy weather, you see a tiny, tiny trickle coming out of that in heavy rain. So, if you think about that sponge city principle of how do we hold on to water and how do we use it, there are small interventions that you can do that are relatively easy. Although the listed building thing didn't make this too easy, and we learned a lot about cutting down pipes on, and doing surveys and all that kind of stuff, which is really important to do. So yeah, that was they've been a real success, and they're cared for by the staff there as well. This is the Potter's Wheel. I've only got a couple more, and I will race through them. This is the Potter's Wheel in Swansea, and this was funded through a Welsh Government programme. It now has 2 green walls. It's bookended by green walls on either side, and it's got an extra level of residential on the top. This is Burrows Road, previous unloved dead end, and now has a bioretention rain garden, which was designed by Robert Bray Associates. I actually took better pictures this morning, which are these ones, because it looks so much better, and I really wanted to try. The shade doesn't make me able to get a whole end of street one, but it's looking really good. And the residents are really, really pleased. A lesson for us is that we wanted to know more about how it worked. The Environment Centre. So this is the Environment Centre on Peer Street in Swansea, and it now looks like this. This green wall here that you can see is not actually a typical green wall. It's a downpipe disconnector. So it's a vertical rain planter, like the ones we saw earlier, but stuck on the building, made out of aluminium. There is a green roof here on top of the building, if you look above the glass windows. And then they've spilled out onto the street with these diverse biodiverse planters that they maintain as demonstrations. This is one that's not worked so well. This was the problem with bins outside Swansea Mosque. So we made these green bin roof stores. The green roofs weren't delivered to spec, and they had to kind of go out and try and make the substrate a little bit deeper. So there's a lot around the detail. You know, things don't work if they're too shallow in terms of green roofs. This is the Biophilic Living Building, which I'm sure all of you are aware of. This is a really good example of our engagement being successful. The architects actually attended our workshops and were really interested in asking us, could they see early copies of our draft strategy, because they wanted to align their development to it. We also have a green space factor tool, which I haven't mentioned, but that's about measuring quality and quantity of green space, permeable green space on developments. And they wanted to run with it and make sure that they were complying with that early on. So yeah, they got copies of drafts with spelling mistakes and all, but it was great. You know, it was just open and honest. This is another one that's not worked so well.
Can I give you 1 minute, Fran?
Yeah, you can. I think this is the last one.
Thanks.
Is that the last one? Yeah. Okay. Wales' largest green roof, which is the coastal park. People often don't think this has been a green roof. It is Wales' largest green roof, and it is surrounded by climbing green walls, which are the simplest, easiest ones. So that is it. Sorry, took too long. Thanks, Jen.
No, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt because I was enjoying it, and there's lots to take from that. And I just could see you had quite a few slides left, so I wanted to make sure we had time to fit everyone in. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. I think lots of food for thought there. So thank you for sharing that process and some of the outcomes of that. We'll whiz on to Simon next. Do keep dropping your questions in the chat. Simon Richards is from Land Studio, based in North Wales, also one of our DCFW panel members. And he's going to share some ideas around a holistic approach to green infrastructure. So Simon, I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Jen, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks, Fran. That was really interesting. And I think that whole multifunctional approach is something that we'll touch on here. And really, I think there are two key points that I wanted to discuss in the next 10 or 15 minutes. And really, firstly, was thinking about that, I suppose, multifunctional approach or holistic approach to green infrastructure. So how can we make sure when we're planning and implementing green infrastructure networks that we bring ecology, water, communities and a sense of place and placemaking to the fore, and make sure that there's a multi-layered approach. So that's something I'm going to touch on with a few examples that have been constructed, as well as then a project that we're working on in Bridgend at the moment. And then going following up with just an idea that we're thinking about and looking at is how could we possibly look at an alternative funding model to underutilized land within our towns and cities and within our kind of urban fringe. Is there a way that we could look at funding biodiversity or green infrastructure elements whilst not which are outside the ownership of a developer or a landowner? So thinking about a holistic approach, I suppose, what does that mean? And I think really it's that very much that strategic thinking, and really that's embedded within the Building with Nature principles, which are also in turn embedded within the 2016 Environment Act. The 12 standards of the Building with Nature principles really respond to biodiversity enhancement and protection and enhancement through climate change, delivery of water management in terms of drainage, flood attenuation and all that side of things, well-being and the integration of community. And those three elements all overlay within one another really to fulfill the idea of a sense of place and creating distinctive places. And whilst I think we're all broadly in the built environment world aware of Building with Nature principles, I think it's really important just to keep those at the top of your mind when we're thinking about green infrastructure networks and how we can be thinking about and designing these networks to be implemented going forward. Ultimately, if done successfully, they bring with them a huge number of benefits, as Fran talked through in her talk earlier on. And I think there's a range of benefits. I won't go into too much detail because I think Fran covered a lot of them, but I think that whole point from community benefit to nature and water brings together what you could term as the green grid, and how that green grid is a manifestation of that layering of different uses within a town or a city. So how can ecology corridors also be multifunctional for community use, but we also provide for flood attenuation and all of those things. So we're thinking about all of those key elements in one cohesive network. So some examples of these, which are not all perfect, but they've got some interesting examples and some interesting aspects to them. Firstly, at a kind of larger scale, a scheme that we're familiar with, our studios based in Chester. So a couple of Millennium projects that have been implemented over the last 20 odd years. The Millennium Greenway that runs on the old Mickle Trafford rail line, and that goes right from the North Wales coastal towns right through Chester to Mickle Trafford, and then the Dee River Path as well. What they do is provide continuous active travel links between various towns, suburban areas, and the city itself. They also provide ecological corridors between each of those areas, and between a number of specialist and designated landscape areas within the area. So they provide a really important benefit both to people and to nature. They also provide an important function of crossing over some of the key barriers, and this is something we'll come on to in a moment. So things like the canal, the M53, the North Wales Expressway, all of these things become really fundamental barriers to people and to nature. So it's an interesting example, perhaps an early example of kind of how green infrastructure has been implemented and how it's developed over the last quarter of a century since the millennium, which doesn't seem that long ago. Perhaps a more detailed example is the Regent's Canal Corridor and Coal Drops Yard at King's Cross that's evolved over the last 5 or 10 years. I think it's interesting here, and this is where we get into the multi-layering of places, really. So over 40% of the land area is set aside for open space, but there's an interesting layering between perhaps more ecologically focused spaces, as something like the Camley Street Natural Park, and then perhaps the more public realm or community focused spaces like Coal Drops Yard and the photo you're looking at here. So, but within each of them, there's the cohesive network of ecological thinking, water and drainage thinking. So surface water drainage through this area is really important, as well as that how they link into the wider ecological and green infrastructure network of Camden and Islington. So that's, I think, how this development has come forward over the last 5 or 10 years. And I remember it from early in the 2000s when nothing was here at all, that it's been a really interesting kind of layering of really high quality public realm as well as areas for nature. And I think that also interestingly comes about through the partnerships that have come through from private developers as well as the public sector and people like the London Wildlife Trust, who manage and maintain elements of this and advise on management programs for it. So you get a really diverse range of spaces. Then in Manchester, an example that I'm sure you're all very aware of, but I think it's useful just to pick up perhaps on a couple of key aspects of it from a green infrastructure perspective. Mayfield Park in Manchester, first new park in a century, but really I think from today's particular angle, I think is really about the restoration of the River Medlock and the restoration of what was originally called Meadow Stream. So this aerial shot from pre-development, it's not much of a meadow stream, but then as it's moved through into the development of the park itself, it's the restoration of that river corridor. But importantly, hanging off that is the development of a riparian corridor of ecological habitat. There's the attenuation and flood measures that the opening up of that river corridor provides. And then as an overall master plan, it's providing both for nature as well as for the community with play areas and public realm and open areas. But also it was built as the first piece within the master plan, which is, so it's truly a kind of a landscape-led master plan. So development plots are there to be developed in the future, but actually with a park at its core. So again, the example here, you can see the community spaces, and there was an intentional layering by Studio Egret West to have the natural landscape sitting within the river corridor and slightly sort of out of reach from members of the community, but actually then more community focused spaces away from that. So you get this multi layering of nature and community space and water management, which is really interesting. So a project that we're working on at the moment and is kind of currently in development and very much at a strategic level is an area of land to the north of Bridgend that we're looking at, which very much runs from the town centre, running out to the more suburban and rural, semi-rural areas. It's got a number of key constraints and key characteristics that have an influence on how we could look at layering up a potential green infrastructure network for the study area. There's some key constraints, as I've mentioned, in terms of the M4 corridor cuts right through it from east to west. There's a number of rail lines. Active travel in the area is pretty limited. There's poor connectivity between pedestrian routes and general active travel routes and travel to things like train stations and things like that between communities. The hydrology of the area is very interesting. There's the main river running through the east of the site, which has flood zones associated with it. But there's also the opportunities presented by the wide array of smaller streams and springs that occur within the area. So how could they start to become part of that kind of network of green infrastructure that we've been looking at? As with a lot of our rural and urban spaces, our nature's become extremely fragmented. It's an interesting study site. There's a number of triple SIs, SACs, pieces of ancient woodland, but they're becoming fragmented or they have become fragmented. So how do we pull them together? What opportunities are there for linking all of those things together? And similarly, from a population point of view, you've got a very higher density of population towards the town centre, and then as that moves out to rural areas, it becomes less, but also you get less connectivity, less ability for people to move through the different areas, and obviously the M4 creates that key boundary as well. So as an initial sort of diagram, I suppose we started to say, right, well, if we layer up the hydrology mapping, if we layer up the ecology mapping, how do we fill in the gaps? How do we connect water courses, open up water courses, connect pieces of habitat, create new habitat to link them together? Can we reuse or use or reuse transport corridors that are either in use, in active use, or that have been abandoned? They're good locations for connecting through. How can we connect across huge barriers like the M4 or rail lines or other large road infrastructure, both for people and for nature? And then in terms of active travel, how can we then overlay a cohesive network over the top of that to create links between communities and to key pieces of rail infrastructure and things, and also to tourist attractions and more rural areas? Thinking about underutilized land, which we'll come on to, but how do pieces of land not just become active travel routes, but also public realm spaces, so multifunctional? Can they become community places for communities to dwell and have events in? Can you move through it? How does it connect into a community? And ultimately that starts to become a kind of a multi-layered map and diagram that starts to say, well, actually we can identify some key corridors and key areas for intervention in terms of active travel connections or new areas of ecology or areas for surface water attenuation and surface water strategy. So there's a wide range of aspects, and it's very early days, it's very strategic, but I think that it starts to kind of paint a picture of how we could create that green grid and bring all of these different aspects together. And I think really it's that strategic thinking that makes the key, is the key point really. It's how the green grid, that cohesive network, but it's also a connection from urban to rural, it's the use of transport corridors, and it's about a more strategic approach to surface water drainage, as well as how we could use the potential for use of underutilized land. So just moving on to that quickly, just to finish up really, there's an idea that we could look at within our towns and cities, and I think we're probably all aware of huge numbers of these little parcels, of identifying the sort of underutilized or the undevelopable land. So what could they be used for? They're often let go. There's nothing particularly managing them. They're mown grass, or they're a couple of trees lonely in their space. So is there a way we could use biodiversity or community to enhance those spaces? And something we've been looking at as a potential funding model is something that's emerged out of the recent environmental legislation, particularly biodiversity net gain in England, where there's a commercial market for biodiversity credits emerging. It's not necessarily there with net benefit for biodiversity in Wales, but I think it might be something that does come along in the future. So could we use the funding that could generate to contribute to the management of these parcels of underutilized land? In the example we have in Bridgend, we've started identifying various parcels of land, and that's a key first process to say, well, where are these pieces of land and what do they do? Who owns them, and what potentially could they be? I think, as I say, we can all identify with them. They range from everything from cemeteries and churchyards to leftover pieces of space on the side of highways to parks themselves that are perhaps a little underutilized. So how could they become better, both for people, but importantly for nature, and also potentially for water and surface water attenuation and that side of things? An example we're looking at in the north of England is taking that baseline biodiversity value. So how could we see what the habitat value of that piece of land is using the biodiversity net gain metric? And then how do we apply that in a series of calculations to say, well, actually, there's a biodiversity value to that in ecological terms. And if we were to enhance that with the creation of various habitats, that has a commercial value to it. So does that capital receipt, as it were, for selling credits, could that fund the long-term management of those spaces? And I think it's something that could be really interesting for particularly the public sector and local authorities to think about, is how you could think about the management costs, because I know that's a key issue with public landscape. How could it be implemented in a better way? So just to finish up, really, some key conclusions. I think we should be looking at land holdings more strategically across our towns and cities. So rather than looking at site-specific issues, we need to think more strategically to go, well, how could we link up various pieces of land? We also, on the basis of that, need to look at the complexities of land ownership, because there's huge numbers of landowners. The land registry is a warren of different red lines around different parcels of land. So how could we actually try and stitch those together? And you need an incentive to be able to get landowners to come on board to do that. But also then, and that incentive, I suppose, is the new biodiversity legislation. Could we use that as an incentive to fund the management of these green infrastructure networks? And then lastly, I think that whole collaborative approach is really important. So how can we bring the public and the private sectors together? So if a private developer needs biodiversity credits for their site, could the public sector provide it within leftover land within the towns and cities? So there's some interesting ideas and some really strategic thoughts that we could take forward, I think, just to see how we could use biodiversity and green infrastructure to kind of regenerate and help implement within our town centres and our cities. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. Again, loads to think about there, and really emphasising the fact that green infrastructure is not a thing on its own, is it? It's very much linked to lots of other things that we're talking about around our towns and cities, active travel, community spaces, community engagement, connectivity, all of those things come into play. So yeah, I think the idea of your sort of grids and your layering is really relevant to a lot of that conversation. Yeah. Brilliant. we're going to come on to our final speaker, Dan, next. I'm going to give him his 15 minutes. So if you're able to stick around for Q&A after, and we'll run a little bit after 1 o'clock, but it'd be great to hear from you. So I can see a couple of questions, but do keep adding those. So yeah, thank you, Dan, for joining us. Dan is from Arup, and he's going to be sharing some examples and practical advice, particularly around retrofitting SUDs into urban environments. So over to you, Dan. Thank you.
Real. Thanks, Jen. I knew that going last meant that might have to be more efficient, so if you bear with me, I'll go a bit quicker. So I'll skim through this, but basically I'm from Cardiff. My mum's from Hong Kong, dad's from Vietnam. Wanted to go into buildings initially, having had a love of grand designs, but ended up doing a placement year with Arup in the water team. And that's where I fell in love with all things water cycle, but especially SUDs. So I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a few schemes now. Towards the beginning of starting as a grad, I was selected to be on the Future Gen Leadership Academy. So that was with Sophie Howe, the former Future Gen Commissioner, now Derek Walker. So I maintain good links with them. And then final thing is sometimes with these kind of events, when I'm fairly new to the industry, a bit of imposter syndrome. I think a lot of people can have this, but I think a lot of us on the call, we're on the same team, but there's people within the sector and decision makers that don't always get why we want to make some of these changes. And so it's about how do we try and convince hearts and minds to get green infrastructure in the right places. I will very briefly touch through the broader challenges, but my focus sat in the water team is water. And so there's often too much, too little, or too dirty. The middle point is a few years old now, but Cardiff came out as the wettest city in the UK. I've seen other data to say otherwise, but ultimately it's wet in Cardiff. Swansea's pretty high up there as well, Fran. But there's CSO spills all across Wales. Wales is one of the worst locations in terms of CSO spills, and actually you can see in the graph that spills continue to go up. That's clearly a big challenge. But then we also, particularly in now, there's challenges of extreme heat as well. So we've got all of these competing demands. And so how do we make our space work better for people? And so, yeah, I mentioned about the hook being water, predominantly whether it's funding or to get stuff initially on the table, but we have to be really careful to make sure we think about other things that it connects to. So I've touched on urban heat and even river health through to, well, how do we fund and finance some of these things that Simon touched on? It's a really complex network, but if we can start to unpick it and get stakeholders to talk together, I think we can make real change at scale. But I guess this is the context we're also in. We've got cuts to public services. The hot off the press Future Gen report says that Wales is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. As well as lots of properties being at risk of flood risk. So not an easy task, but it's possible. And so SUDs, particularly in my area of expertise, nature-based solutions that help to manage water volume, but also have water quality benefits, as well as the other people benefits too, as really helpfully represented in this cycle. And so I guess one nod to Arup and the language that we might try to use is this design with water concept, where it's really important to think about all of the different areas, sectors, points of influence that we could have by working with water. And so it's a layered approach, green grid, Simon used, or yeah, this concept just makes sure that we do think holistically, not just in silos. So I'm going to talk on 3 case studies really quickly. One of them, firstly, is Wood Street in centre of Cardiff, outside the BBC Wales headquarters and train station. So context, particularly that's distinct for Wales compared to across the border, is the SUD standards that came into effect in 2019. So we helped Welsh Gov to review how it's going. There's some recommendations that can be made in the short term to make life easier for all. But then from a Cardiff context, politically, SUDs and sustainable water management is quite high on the agenda. And so how do we use that to our advantage? This particular scheme, that was our red line boundary, right in the center of town next to the stadium. And these were the objectives. So ultimately, first and foremost, it's about placemaking, making a space that's more fit for people, not just for cars. But how do we use green infrastructure, sustainable drainage, nature-based solutions as a way to bring nature back to this otherwise previously very grey part of town? So like Fran, I love a good before and after. So this is a few photos of how Wood Street has changed, where you had quite high buildings that kind of engulfed pavements, quite narrow pavements, not very accessible, and then lots of bigger buildings that came as a part of Central Square, and then buildings that came down. But that's what it looks like now, with our SUDS features very much woven into the fabric. These are some of the challenges for any retrofit green infrastructure or SUDS, but particularly for this location. So we're right next to the stadium, thousands of fans when the road's shut on match day. How do we try and design so that people aren't falling into these features? But also the number of utilities we encountered were huge. It was really congested. So how do we try to overcome that and still put green infrastructure that's below ground, that's performing a water attenuation benefit, whilst we're working around lots of known and unknown utilities? Fast forward lots of steps, I appreciate, but this is what it looks like now. So I think it was a real success to be able to still put in our rain gardens and tree pits on both sides. There's a camber in the road, so we needed to put SUDS on both pavements. But people do work and walk around the spaces, and on match days, I don't think anyone's fallen in yet. Cars don't park in it. So I think that's a really good thing. And so we need to do more of this across our urban spaces. Second case study. So this is across the border briefly in Mansfield. I wasn't sure if it was North or Midlands. I think it's on the border, but anyway, it's north from where we are. But this is the largest flood resilience scheme in the UK. So we were appointed by Severn Trent Water to help design and implement an urban flood resilience scheme based off nature-based SUDS solutions instead of grey. And so how do we, to reference a phrase previously used, how do we make Mansfield a sponge city, sponge town? And so we used data and AI machine learning to come up with this catchment-wide approach. So this is the whole town on the right-hand side. And then I was involved, having been involved in other delivery of SUDS schemes, to design and implement the first scheme, the town hall. The town hall car park. Town hall you can see on the left, just to the north. So you can see, basically it was just a car park. It's quite a steep site. So how on earth are we going to change that for people whilst holding back as much water as possible? So left is the after, right is our design. I mentioned it's quite a steep site, so the road to the bottom, all the water comes in from the bottom and is heading towards the town hall in the north. Interestingly, as Fran mentioned, it was a listed building, so some of those challenges as well. But the principle is that we've got the red boxes indicate SUDS features kind of hidden amongst the wider placemaking work. And then there's a bonus red rectangle to the bottom that was added later on. So these all connect to each other. Water flows to the north, but for those exceedance events where there's loads of water that would typically have flash flooding, we've designed these weirs that have controlled overflow points that ultimately water ends up at that bottom rain garden towards the town, next to the town hall. And you'll note in the top left that there's the road on the left-hand side, Exchange Row. It didn't naturally slope towards our SUDS features. So what we did do is put in a channel drain at shallow depth that then connected into the bottom rain garden to make sure that all water did end up in our SUDS features. So another before and after. This is what it looked like before. Not very appealing for people particularly. And so by changing it, making it this what is now called the Memorial Gardens, we've been able to make a green space, but it's functional. It's holding back a lot of water. And down the bottom, we've got place for seating for people. And this was alluded to as well, but I guess the phrase, the devil is in the details. It's got to look good. If people don't like how it looks, regardless of all the other benefits for flooding, they won't like it. And so it's really important that any inlets, overflows, how people are going to interact with the space across the whole cycle, it's got to work. And so, yeah, we thought long and hard about how it would all fit together, as well as on this pretty steep site. So yeah, I think that's quite a success. Third case study, close to home, back in Cardiff, my neck of the woods. We're working with the council and it's a kind of next step from Wood Street and Green and Grangetown for those who know that scheme. Whitchurch. So this is a residential area in the north of Cardiff. Our extent is pretty big, but I think the key things to focus on is that there's a watercourse, Whitchurch Brook, that flows right through the middle of our catchment. And so the brook is prone to flash flooding. It takes water up from Caerphilly up north in the rural catchment. But then we've also got the challenge of surface water flood risk on all of the impermeable areas in that white line. And so it's a combination of works within the brook and SUDs across the catchment. So these are the funding drivers. This is funded predominantly by Welsh Government to manage flood risk, but using the principles of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, really important that any investment has to link to wider wellbeing goals as well. And so where we're using SUDs, we want nature-based, not grey solutions, but also we need to make sure that anything that we do propose on changing on these streets, whether it's the high street or people's residential streets, it's got to make life better for them too. So yeah, some photos, I think it's 2020 floods, but it does flood quite regularly, particularly on the high street. So it's a big area. So in order to help proportion our interventions, we categorize different types of street. So we've got the high street I mentioned on the purple line, through to the river, people walking next to the watercourse for the well-being and connectivity to schools. But then we've also got tons of residential streets, quite narrow. And so how do we find that balance of peppering it with SUDs for that catchment flood risk, flood relief, but at the same time recognizing people park on these streets and are going to have to face these every day. So these are the really key design principles that we applied throughout the scheme. Yes, we need to control water at source and the brook, but ultimately this might be a scheme that we have a chance to do once in a lifetime, and so we want to make sure that it's going to be fit for purpose for people now and into the future. And so this is kind of in two images is the journey to date. Started off with a bit of a concept strategy, thinking about how do we connect to larger green parks, the rivers, and other key infrastructure within our boundary and beyond the boundary. And then how do we translate that to spatially? We know that when we take a concept and put it into a real world, it can be really challenging to make things fit, make things work. But that's the concept, is we want to make our streets greener, but kind of functionally greener as well, capturing surface water at source and slowing water down before it drained into the brook, which is also prone to flooding. So, summary, after those 3 case studies, things that I've learned, our team have learned, how do you design better places? I think it's really important to find your hook. We've talked a few different things about nature or flooding or heat. The one, at least the one I'm closest to is water. Flood risk, particularly in Wales, that is often our route in. And then how do you try and bring in others who are sit in other teams, probably not flood risk, but also to get their buy-in. The middle point's really important here is we might have, like I said, one chance to do this and do it well. So don't just be too close-minded to what we can do, push boundaries and use different really amazing legislation and policy that we have in Wales to challenge people. I think a really important one that often is not necessarily talked about are areas of deprivation, that people who get impacted most by climate change are often the ones who don't have anyone to advocate. So how do we do that right from the beginning? And then finally, partnering with people. Like, this is so important. If we just come in with our solution hats on without engaging the people it's going to impact once we're done, then I think we're going to have problems later down the line. And so how do we work with residents and businesses to help shape what our solution looks like? I think compromise is really important. Some of the non-negotiables, yes, but it's got to work for people. So whilst I'd love to put spongy stuff all across a location, if it's not going to work for the people that it's going to encounter every day, then we might need to tweak. And this is just a slide I put down the end, which is just drone footage of Wood Street, but we can skip this. But anyway, if anyone wants to ask any questions after this call, drop me a message on LinkedIn, or Jen can pass my contact details.
Brilliant, thank you, Dan. That's really helpful. I'm sure lots of people on the call can relate to those car park spaces that you showed, converting that into a more usable but also sustainable space, and also those high street considerations and the residential areas around in Whitchurch. Really helpful. Thank you very much. We've got, we'll spend a few minutes on questions, so do please add any questions if you've got any. The first one that popped in from Mike is around cost of maintenance, and we have touched on this. Simon, you've suggested some ideas in the future for this, but very much that a tree, a planter, is seen as a maintenance cost rather than necessarily a benefit by some. How do we go about making the case for introducing more rather than removing these from our town centres? Fran, did you want to come in on that at all? How did you deal with that in the strategy?
So I think being honest that maintenance is a cost. We often talk about caring for a space and investing in the skills that are needed to do that. And I touched on, we often, in the public sector, there's often a bit of a lean into, volunteers can look after this, and actually we should be paying people to do this stuff, whilst encouraging communities to be stewards of spaces, their spaces. So there's a balance between making sure that we're designing things for the maintenance that we can actually do, and not designing something for maintenance we're never going to do. So that, when we're talking about public realm and things like that, being honest with, what resources you have. And we've discussed different things. We've never done it for Swansea City Centre, but we've discussed because it's a special place and it has regeneration funding, could we have a separate budget for maintenance of the things that happen within the public realm? So there are a few different models. There's also, in terms of upskilling local people who already are gardeners and who are already doing that, but don't have the ability to go for these contracts. And so how do we enable them to do that? The Bridget Joyce Square, and Dan, you showed a picture of one of the rain gardens in Bridget Joyce Square, which actually has a scooter bit that you can scoot through it on, this near an area with kids and stuff. And that's managed by a charity under a contract with the council, and it's paid for, but they engage masses with the community in doing that. So it's a big kind of community sort of engagement project involvement stuff that's happening. And it's in an area, Bridget Joyce Square is in an area that has a significant amount of antisocial stuff that goes on in that area, and they haven't seen that happen within the scheme. So there's community involvement and finding a way to be clever enough about paying at least for the first 3 years of a lot of these things, because it's often in that time where plants get established, you need to replace things if they die. Sometimes you've got to be a bit clever about how you fund things.
I think that's really helpful, bringing it back to that very early engagement that you talked about, listening to people, finding out who's there, who can do what, who wants to be involved. Where we had a placemaking event recently, a conference, where there was a lot of talk about kind of citizen model of managing places, and how do we shift the emphasis from we pay our council to do these things and they need to look after it, to how can we collectively look after our places. But I think you're right, Fran, that we shouldn't expect people to just do that for free. There needs to be an understanding that there's an arrangement in place to cover that. Great, thank you. Unless anyone else wants to come in on that question, I'll move on to the next. No? Okay. A question about green walls. Any best practice advice? The question asks about alternative green walls. I'm not quite sure what is alternative about them, but retrofitting green walls in spaces. Any advice on that from anyone?
So I would say, what do you want it to do? Start off with that. Why do you want a green wall in the first place? If it's because it looks cool and you've got loads of money, then go for something really, really intensive. If you want something that's particularly biodiverse and really easy to maintain, go for something like a climbing green wall. But there's, green walls are usually retrofitted, if you look at the majority of them. So it just depends what you want them to do. So I would start off with that question of, why do I want a green wall? What do I want it to do? And then design from there.
Great, thank you. Just looking through the other questions. Yes, another one about placekeeping. Simon, did you want to elaborate at all on your thoughts around that, on the potential for how we think about managing place in the future and that sort of placekeeping aspect? Is it better to have less done better, and tackling those spaces that you identified, sort of those underused spaces?
Yeah, I think it's just really interesting. I think we're in a different, as we all know, the whole climate around publicly funded space and maintenance of space, or maintenance of public services more widely, has fundamentally shifted in the last 5 or 10 years. So I think we need to think about lots of different ways of funding landscape and how habitats, as well as community spaces and public realm, can be financed, because otherwise we can't rely on that traditional model, because it doesn't really exist anymore. And I think the point that I was just sort of touching on was kind of saying, well, I know private developers, people we're working with, are looking at buying up pieces of land to fund their biodiversity habitat within sites, to provide them with biodiversity credits. So if you took that same model and applied that and said, well, actually, there's plenty of spare land out there that can't really be developed for commercial gain or change of use or anything like that, then you could actually implement that for biodiversity credits, take the commercial value out of it to fund the maintenance of it. So it's both providing offset for development, but also cost and funding for future maintenance.
Yeah, great, thank you. Just perhaps one final point then. When we talk about placemaking, we talk about it as a way of working as much as anything else. So the public realm that we end up with is part of it, but it's how we work with other colleagues across disciplines along the way. Dan, you picked this up on your slides about sort of perhaps starting with a water issue, but expanding that out to include getting it right for as many reasons as possible. Did you want to share anything more on that, just briefly, around working with other disciplines, the challenges and opportunities of that?
Yeah, I think particularly those of us who are working in Wales, Welsh government has made it quite clear that it wants a place-driven approach. And so I think it's trying to understand what are the local commitments, whether it's your council, Welsh government, the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, and use some of those policies and the wording to kind of challenge people if decisions in the now don't match where we're trying to be for the long term. I mentioned about the Future Gen report this week. The headline is that Wales isn't doing enough, and so whilst we might default to business as usual or how things are normally done and all the hoops to jump through, I think we need to be more creative and just challenge a bit more, because the pace that we're doing some of these really good examples we've talked about isn't enough. Simon, you touched on the funding and financing issue. This is somewhere that I also recognise as a big challenge, but also potential enabler. And so I'm currently seconded part-time to a company called Entrade. It's a working model in the UK that I think is the leading marketplace for nature recovery. It essentially facilitates businesses to be able to invest in nature recovery. In Wales, we don't have the policy and regulatory framework yet, but we're having conversations with the relevant stakeholders, whether it's Welsh Gov or otherwise, to make it an investable proposition for private sector. And so that doesn't just involve urban spaces, that could span the whole of Wales. And so the opportunities are quite big, but we need to think creatively about how to leverage blended private public sector finance, make it work harder, but also in the right places for the right kind of multi-benefits we're talking about. The context varies across the 4 corners of Wales, but within the urban fabric, I think there's real opportunity if we use public commitments to just help gently guide people to what are better solutions.
Great, thank you. I can see a little bit of additional chat going on in the chat there. That's great. Do keep that going. I invite our speakers, if you want to drop your email addresses into the chat, if you're happy for people to get in touch with you to discuss anything further, then please do that. But otherwise, our time is very much up. We've covered a great deal of ground. And I'd really like to thank Dan, Simon and Fran for their contributions today. Like I say, very much an introduction to some of these issues and ideas. I'm very happy to take feedback on what you might want to find out about more. And do get in touch with us. We've got more webinars coming up so we can dive into things more specifically. So yeah, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.